I'm super excited to talk to your group because we don't often get the opportunity to talk to groups in the United States. So this is a very special evening for me. The British Home Children, I don't know how many of you have heard about the Home Children, but they were a massive influx of children brought from all areas of the UK into Canada. Now, the interesting thing about the Home Children is it didn't start in Canada. It didn't start in England. Where it started was in the United States. I don't know how many have heard about the orphan train movement, but it ran from 1854 down to 1929. It relocated about 200 children from the overcrowded eastern U.S. cities to rural foster homes in the Midwest. It was intended to reduce poverty and provide labor to farms short on workers. Children were said to be orphaned, abandoned, abused, or homeless, but in reality, many of them were not. They were mostly poor children of new immigrants and the children of poor and destitute families living in these cities. The criticisms were weak screening of caretakers, little to no follow-up, and many children exploited as farm laborers rather than cared for. Now, the fella that was running the orphan trains, Reverend Van Meter, um, gave a lecture in London, England in 1868. And in his audience was Maria Susan Rye. And Maria Rye had been immigrating young women into Canada at that time. And Canada didn't want the young women because they considered them to be immoral and spreading their disease around. And they also accused them of bringing in a high percentage of illegitimate children and that kind of thing. So there was a lot of pushback from the Canadian government. So when she was in the audience, it struck her that maybe she should begin a program similar to the orphan trains. So what she did is she traveled down into Chicago, where it was, where it was running out of from one of the main centers. And she oversaw the programs down there. And we're talking in 1869 by this time. And she was really impressed and enthusiastic about the orphan train movement. So she came up into Niagara-on-the-Lake in Canada here, secured a receiving home, and made her way back to the UK. And in the UK, she gathered together a party of children. And by November of 1869, she brought her first party of children to Canada. And what happened following that is that there were over 100,000 children that were immigrated in these programs, not quite the 2,000 that were moved around in the United States. I actually was pretty shocked at the number of children that were involved with the orphan trains. I thought 100,000 was enough, a large number. The British Home Children were a mass migration that began in 1869, as we said, sending children from the United Kingdom to Canada. Over 100,000 children brought. Early children were typically from impoverished, orphaned, or destitute backgrounds, but many came from families in need. And the things that we have just said about the orphan trains, you can say the exact same things about the child migration programs. There was concerns that were raised on all of those points with the work of Maria Rye, who was followed closely by Annie McPherson. They were sent under various child immigration schemes, often without full consent or understanding. And they were placed in Canadian home and farms to work as laborers and domestic servants. People think that they were brought here to be part of loving families, and they weren't. The children were brought here so that their services be useful to the farmers. And Dr. Bernardo himself had made that statement early in the migration programs. As I said, they were placed in Canadian farms and homes to work as laborers and domestic. And a child did not need to be born in the UK to be a home child. All that needed to happen was that the family unit was living in the UK at the time that the family fell apart, or there was a death or an illness or a desertion, or even if one of the parents were disabled or something like that, your child could be taken into the homes, doesn't matter where they were born, and sent to Canada as home children. My mom was a British home child, and that's why I became interested in these programs. And she didn't say anything to us until she was about 86 years of age. And in order for her to tell us that there was something up with her background, it took all the emotions, all the strength, everything that she had inside her to simply say to me, "I was born in England," and that simple sentence really opened the floodgates to a lot of information and, a lot of background that she didn't even know herself because she was 2. It really changed the dynamics of our family. I mean, my grandparents will always be my grandparents, my adoptive grandparents, but we had this whole birth family that we knew nothing about. So my mother actually had 5 brothers and sisters, and it's a long story, so we're not going to get too much into that tonight. But those brothers and sisters were actually born in Canada. And then the family had relocated to the UK, and it was while they were living in the United Kingdom. Now, mom was the only one of the children that were actually born in England, but it was while they were living in the United Kingdom that my grandfather deserted the family and left my grandmother alone with all these children to look after. Now, at the age of 2, they of course wouldn't send them out to farms to work. But what they would do with them is that they would foster them out until they were old enough to work on farms, and then they would, likely just remove them from the foster families and put them out to work. We have a lot of home children that we've identified who are connected to Indiana. So we had our Penny May that heads our burial index. She pulled up these names for me today so that we could see that we do have a connection to Indiana, and we do have one that is buried in Fort Wayne, Cecil Eric Christie, and he was married in Fort Wayne and had moved from Canada down into the United States, and we have found that there was a large segment of our home children that did move into the United States for a whole variety of reasons. And we had a lot of home children that also served in the wars and served for the United States. We have identified to date almost 800 home children buried in the United States. That's 8% of the total number of British home child burials that we know, and we have a listing of some 11,000 home children burials, but we have a long way to go because there was over 100,000 children. So that 8% could and probably will change, but when we kinda look at that number, overall, it could mean that there are some, 8 to 10,000 home children buried in the United States, if not more. So, it's something that we really need to be tapping into, and we really need to be educating people, in your country about, the home children, because I have found all kinds of descendants, there. And they're shocked to know because a lot of them don't know about this little detour to Canada before they moved into the States. Oh, this is my personal connection. So that's my mom. She's rocking that, 60s outfit over there. I thought she was pretty good looking mom. That's a picture of her taken in Canada. That was the very first picture that was ever taken of my mom, and she's 2 in that picture. And, when we get into her family history, we found out that her father was also a home child. So there's a lot of home children dynamics that are going on in this family. Overall, I have found about 15 home children that are connected. Maybe not full blood relatives, but definitely connected to my family. So it's just a given that I'm going to be doing this for the rest of my life. It all began in Victoria, England, with, the overcrowded living conditions brought on by the Industrial Revolution, bringing a large mass of people into the big cities like London, England. That's something needed to be done. I'm not so sure that this was the exact program that they needed, but, in the years that these programs were running, they didn't have social systems available in the UK. So, I mean, my mother was born in 1922, so she was a little bit later on in the programs, but even by 1922, there was nothing for her mom to do. Her mom, was not educated, and, she didn't have a job, and she couldn't support her children. So, she ended up having to put the, children in the Kingston Union Workhouse in Lingdon, Herefordshire, and they stayed in that workhouse for 2 years until they were plucked out by the Salvation Army sent to Canada as home children. So, it's either you had institutions that were built by Annie McPherson, Maria Rye, Dr. Bernardo. Most of the sending organizations had like collecting homes over in the UK, but you know, The thing is that, with when we talk about Dr. Bernardo, who was one of the best known sending organizations of all of them, he had about 350,000 children in his care over the years. He sent 33,000 children to Canada. And, it was touted as, as they needed to send them to Canada to save them. And in order to admit another child, they had to relieve their overpopulation. But when you think about the numbers, I'm not so sure that all that rings really true. There was pushback to the child migration programs from the very beginning, and this is a cartoon that was drawn by George Cruikshank, and there he is with Maria Rye standing by the mud cart with a whip in her hand, and they're shoveling the children off the streets and throwing them upon, this wagon. And they're saying in the speech bubbles that we're going to take you far away so that you will never see your relatives again. And the children in the speech bubbles are crying out for their mother. He saw immigration as inhumane, degrading, dehumanizing, and likened it to shipping cattle to a foreign market. He's talking about human trafficking. That's what he's talking about. He questioned the claim that the children were being saved from poverty, but argued instead they were being used as cheap labor. And that's what they were used at. He pointed out that such treatment would never be considered for middle or upper class children, only that the poor were subjected to such export. And he suggested that this disregard for children's welfare was a stain on a so-called Christian and civilized society. And it definitely was and definitely is. In 1874, they sent Inspector Andrew Doyle to Canada because they were hearing, some not so great things going on in Canada. It was to inspect the Maria Rye and also the Annie McPherson children. Annie McPherson started up shortly after Maria Rye. A lot of people credit McPherson as starting the programs, but she did not. It was Maria Rye. His key findings was there was a lack of supervision after placement. Children were exploited for unpaid labor, lack of consent or informed placement, misleading promises made to families, sending agencies profited from placements. Okay? Sending agencies profited from placements. Children were forced to repay travel costs. No follow-up. Some children just simply disappear. There are some home children that we will never know whatever happened to them or where they went. Severe neglect and abuse in isolated settings. Doyle exposed systemic child exploitation. What he described would be considered human trafficking in our age today. It was considered human trafficking yesterday. We often get people that accuse us of looking at this through the lens of modern time, and that is categorically untrue. I have spent 17 years of my life studying the child migration programs, not through what we think today, but what was said yesterday. In Canada, when you go through the literature, the newspapers, and, it's hard pressed to find in Canada any voices of concern for the well-being of these children. There was over 30 different sending organizations that became involved. You got Emma Sterling, Dr. Bernardo, Dr. Thomas Stevenson, William Quarrier, and they were sent from one end of Canada to the other. Children were mostly sent in parties, often hundreds in a time. So if you're ever doing family history research and you find your child's name in this great big long list here, that is a home child. I don't think that they immigrated other children to Canada and large parties of children like that, unless that's what they were. I mean, I can't think of a other single time that they would have done that. Each were provided with a trunk or a duffel bag, and this is the one that I'm showing here is the most common Dr. Bernardo trunk that there was, and we have quite a few in our collections. George Green was a boy that was placed up in Owen Sound, Ontario. He was absolutely brutally murdered by his mistress. It made newspapers around the world. Now, one would think that with the brutality, and I won't get into it because, let me tell you, it's one of the worst cases of abuse I think I've ever read. And you would think that the brutality of his murder would have caused people to cry out and for help for these children. But Canada didn't care. What we were concerned about is why they were letting that type of child into this country. And this is a cartoon that was published in the Toronto World newspaper in November of 1895. And that's Dr. Bernardo with his sewer pipe from the slums of London, bringing the kids down as sewage and dumping them on good Canadian soil. That was their response to the brutal murder of George Green. And in fact, they brought a law into place in 1897, just a couple years after his murder. And again, you would think that that would be for protection of these children, but it was to protect Ontario against that type of children coming here. Frederick Nichols was a member of our House of Commons. He was also head of the Canadian Manufacturers Association and, wrote the Canadian Manufacturers Association magazine. And he would write lengthy articles, saying things about these home children. But this one in particular was disgusting. He said that these waifs and strays are tainted and corrupt with moral slime and filth inherited from parents and surroundings of the most foul and disgusting character, and which all the washing and clean clothes that Dr. Bernardo may bestow will never possibly remove. There is no power whatsoever that can cleanse the lepers so as to fit them to become desirable citizens of Canada. You know, he called them warts and all kinds of stuff in that article. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Dr. C.K. Clark, who's the head of Canadian psychology. Clark Institute in Toronto was named for him. He was the professor of psychology at the Queen's University in Kingston, and he lectured in his lecture. He said, in Canada, we are deliberately adding to our population hundreds of children bearing all the stigmata of physical and mental degeneracies. The next generation must be considered, but the harvest has already commenced. An insane person here, a criminal there. Well, I'm the next generation. So thank you, Dr. C.K. Clark, for that. Dr. Bernardo, as I said in his 1900 Ups and Downs magazine, a lot of these people that were sending the kids were prolific writers, and they liked to write about what a great thing that they were doing, for the children. But in this one edition, Dr. Bernardo himself writes, "We are not so young and unsophisticated as to imagine that the farmers take our boys for love. The primary object of the farmers in taking a boy is that his services be useful to him." Doesn't say coming here for a better life. It doesn't say, getting your good education. It just said that so your services be useful to him. They were here to work. And in fact, they were brought here to become indentured servants. Indentured means that they were contracted by law to serve out their contracts with the farmers that they were placed with. And if they tried to leave the farms, they could be picked up by the police and brought either back to the Bernardo home or straight back to the farmers. You often find little advertisements in the newspapers for the farmers looking for a child that had taken off from their farm. It's like forced orphanization for profit. Only 12% of these children were, in fact, true orphans, where both parents were dead. Most of them came, particularly after the 1900s, because of the George Green thing. Canada really pushed for a better type of child to be sent to Canada. So in today's society, we do have the mother's allowance and the welfare offices and that kind of stuff. So there is help available in our society today, for families in trouble, but they didn't provide that help in the UK. And in those years, I mean, they were the richest country in the Commonwealth. You think they would have done something better for their children, but they didn't. And like I said, he was contracted from 1907 till April of 1913, $120 minus expenses. So expenses could be a clothing or a haircut, new boots or something like that. But quite often what would happen is the farmer would charge the bank account the money for the new boots and give them to their son. Now, I have to pause and explain where this money went. It wasn't given to the children. It was held in trust accounts for them until their indenture contract was up. Now, their indenture contracts were up when they were 18. Girls were more around the age of 21, but boys, they were 18, but they didn't receive their money from these contracts until they were 21. Now, how many lived until they were 21? How many knew they were supposed to get money, you know? And I can tell you that the sending organizations weren't hunting you down to give you this money. So, where did all this money go? Also, with the Bernardo homes, they were forcing a donation of $1 a year. $1 when you think that they're getting pennies a day for the work would in order to come up with $1, it would be a considerable amount of time that they spent working for nothing. For nothing. Exploitation. In the UK, Canada was marketed as a haven for children, a typical country home over there. I mean, that looks very appealing. Quite one of the family, and my happy home for 10 years. I mean, they sold this as a land of opportunity for the kids, that they were coming here to get a better life. But in reality, this was what they were coming to, which wasn't bad, and not all the kids, some kids worked as domestics in the mansions and stuff like that, but the vast majority of them were sent to the farmers in the country. And there's nothing wrong with these homes, except you see the barn in the lower picture. A lot of children were made to sleep in the barn because of our medical community and our House of Commons and people speaking out about these children that said that they were diseased. Dr. C.K. Clark also told the whole world that these children had syphilis. And the syphilis, if it didn't manifest when they were young, would manifest as, when these children became adults and they would simply just be passing this kind of stuff down to, to their children and their descendants and infecting the whole, Canadian population and weakening us. I mean, that was kind of the things that they said. George Green at one point was made to sleep with the pigs. I have stories of home children that were eating pig slop because they weren't given the proper food and nutrition. And yes, not all children were treated badly, okay? And, there's some home children that got in with good families, which was luck, and that's all it was. They got in with good families who treated them kindly, who treated them as their own. A lot of them inherited the farms and that kind of stuff, but that was the exception and not the rule. As I said, after the 1890s, most came from intact families who had fallen upon hard times. And these are pictures that are starting to surface through Find My Past, through Ancestry, through social media. Families becoming educated and involved are sending these pictures, and these are not gutter children, you know, they're intact families. Like I said, that something happened in the big picture to my right. Both of those parents died of disease and they left their kids to become home children, basically. So they mostly came from families in need. There's only one sending organization that I can think of that really looked after the children that really needed the help, and that would be the Middlemore homes. And there was a lot of desperate family situations that became involved in these programs as well too. It wasn't all just intact families, but the majority. And and something really needed to be done. And so hats off to Middlemore for really focusing on that kind of a family situation. But the question is, did they need to come to Canada to save them? Well, I'll tell you the story of my Aunt Mary. Aunt Mary was rescued from underneath the bed of a dying woman by one of the Bernardo supervisors. And her and her sister were so sick and emancipated and so brutalized that they spent weeks in hospital just to survive. And when they were fairly recovered, Bernardo's removed them from the hospital and sent them to their Barkingside home, which is just outside of London. And it's an idyllic cottage kind of situation. It's actually really pretty. Not saying that institutionalizing a child is a good thing, but it was a very pretty setting for the girls. And at Barkingside, they thrived and they were surrounded by hundreds of children like themselves, and they were doing quite well. So they didn't need to send them to Canada to save them. Okay, so they were already saved. But they did send them to Canada, and in Canada, Aunt Mary was moved 20 times in 8 years. She was whipped, beaten, raped, and gave birth to a stillborn baby at the age of 14. Now, my mother, who came to Canada, received a good home. So I'm on both sides of that coin, the argument about it. But I'll tell you one thing, the fact that my mother received a good home, which was a minority of the children. They say only 25% of the children received decent placements in Canada. I mean, what, so we just ignore what happened to Aunt Mary? Like, that doesn't count because your mother had a good home? Like, I can't reconcile that. I just think that, the situation, the whole program was so seriously flawed that I don't care how many children got a good home, it shouldn't have been allowed to carry on the way that it was. There shouldn't have been children like George Green, there shouldn't have been children like Aunt Mary, and, there's also the argument that, they would have died in England had they sent them to Canada. Well, how do you know that? Like, there's absolutely no information available, no stats, nothing that would ever support that. And yeah, if Aunt Mary hadn't been rescued by Bernardos, they would have died, undoubtedly. But she very well could have died in Canada under the horrific abuse that she suffered here. Bernardo's had over 350,000 children in their care. 33,000 children came to Canada. So what do we think happened to the 300,000 children that were left back in the UK? Did they all die because they weren't sent to Canada? Well, they didn't. All they did was change the odds for that particular child that they sent out of the UK. Some of these children, like George Green, died because they sent them to Canada, because they placed them with irresponsible people, violent people. And would he have survived if he stayed in the UK? Well, he was under the care of Bernardo's. So chances are probably yes. But you can't say that. You don't know. I mean, what would have happened to my mom had they not sent her to Canada? Well, maybe she would have stayed with her mom. I mean, yes, they were poor, but poverty should have never mandated that you lost your kids and they were sent to another country and put to work on farms. I mean, my mom wasn't worked. She was in a good family and she was raised as their child. I mean, all my life I thought that her placement family were my grandparents until 86 years of age. She tells me that they're not, but and hats off to them too, because they saw a little girl who really just needed a home and needed love and and didn't take into account all those things that were repeatedly said about the home children. And how did sending organizations? I mean, they did profit from the placements of these kids for a whole variety of ways. They're also receiving bonuses from the UK government and from the Canadian government. So they'd pay them per head like cattle to get them out of the UK and per head like cattle to get them into Canada, except the workhouse children. They didn't want the workhouse children because they considered poverty to be a disease. So the workhouse children were inferior children, so they wouldn't pay the bonus for the workhouse children. So they wouldn't pay the $2 to get my mom into this country. I want my $2 back with inflation. In 1909, there was 2,424 children immigrated. There was 15,417 applications received, and they were charging $3 per application, non-refundable. And as I said earlier, we cannot ignore the harm suffered by so many simply because some children fared well in Canada. They estimate that 75% of these children did not do well. 100% of these children were stigmatized. 100% of these children suffered the loss of their family, their culture, their friends. 100% of these children were exploited for their labor. Whether they did well or not, they were still trafficked children. They were still exploited, and they never should have been. So this is my Aunt Mary that we've already talked about. This other fellow over here is Cecil Bennett, and Cecil Bennett received a very good placement just outside of Peterborough. He was never expected to work any harder than the other kids. You can see this is a placement photo of his. And, it's, he's well dressed and clean, and he was educated, and he was loved like one of the family. But he went off to war and he was killed on the first day of the Battle of Vimy Ridge. He wasn't even 21 at that point. Remember, 21 is when you could get your money from the sending organizations. Why child migration to Canada stopped? Well, people say it was because of the Depression. Well, the Depression had something to do with it. I mean, obviously, but It caused a slowdown, and for a couple years during the Depression, we weren't bringing children into Canada because there was a lot of backlash from the public, about taking, the good Canadian jobs and that kind of stuff. But it more came to a head because of the deaths of two boys, the suicides of two boys, and you got Johnny Payne and Charles Bulpitt, who both committed suicide. And their suicides made the newspapers around the world, which is interesting because up to that point, there was multiple suicides. I mean, one of the headlines in the UK read another suicide on a Canadian farm, like very blasé about it. But these boys drew a lot of attention. And I think by the 1920s, we were starting to become a little bit more enlightened to the care that these children would need. So there was a lot of Canadian social workers, females, that stood up and spoke out against the treatment of the home children, but it took years before anything really came of it. And it wasn't really until into the 1930s that there was a lot of push put on the Canadian government to tighten up on the migration of these children to Canada, to bring in stricter legislation to protect the children. Finally, somebody was talking about protecting the children. But we had our years in the Depression, and then after the Depression, child migration started up again. So it didn't end it by any means, but there wasn't as many children coming over in those later years. And there was a lot of pushback from the sending organizations, and they all started to slowly withdraw themselves from Canada. And the last organization shut down in 1939, but it continued until 1948 through the Fairbridge Farms, which was bringing children out to Vancouver. And you might be interested to know that King Charles, his King's Trust, is responsible for those Fairbridge children, and they have recently had to pay a compensation to the survivors. So it really ended due to economic, social, and legislative pressures. Um, they didn't end child migration. They just started sending the kids to Australia. Now, they were going to Australia a little bit before that as well too, but Australia became their main country that they were sending the children to. Australia didn't have the rules and regulations and didn't seem to really care. I mean, they were behind on that kind of thing. And they were also sent to South Africa and New Zealand as well. So it didn't end child migration. It just ended child migration to Canada. Fairbridge Farms, like I said, into about 1948, 1949. In 2010, British Prime Minister Gordon Brown apologized to the home children. He also participated in a British independent inquiry into the migration schemes. In 2017, he referred to the programs as government-induced human trafficking. In 2009, just before the British apology, Australia apologized. Yeah, so we've had two apologies from two countries that were involved. But at the time, our immigration minister, who was Jason Kenney, stood up and said that there was no need to apologize for the abuse and exploitations of hundreds of children brought to our shores. I mean, to start with, it wasn't hundreds of children, buddy, it was tens of thousands of children. And if you've already said that they were abused and exploited, why would you not apologize for that? To date, the Canadian government has never held an inquiry into its role in these schemes. Never. Not since the day it shut down. There's never been an inquiry. There were inquiries in England and in Scotland, which we did participate in as well too. The England government issued compensation to the survivors of home children. We only have one left that we know of now, but there was a little handful of them when this compensation came out. So they did receive about $35,000 each. You can't put a dollar sign on the suffering of these kids and what they had to go through in their lives. But the fact that it was recognized that what was done to them was wrong, I think meant more to them than any $35,000 would in a whole lifetime. But at least they got that and got some closure into what had happened in their lives. Most children survived, okay? So that's one thing that we need to also acknowledge. A lot of children got good homes, but most of the home children survived everything that they had to endure and went on to make good lives and make great contributions to Canada. You know, I can go into all kinds of historical events that happened, and you're pretty much always going to find a home child in there somewhere. Like, when the Canadian flag was made, it was Ken Donovan that was given the task to produce the prototypes and get them to the prime minister's office. It was his daughter that had sewed the actual first Canadian flag. And out in Vancouver, the very first Canadian flag was flown by a British home child. There's all kinds of historic events in Canada that these home children were involved in. And one of their greatest contributions is their participation in our wars. We estimate that over 25,000 children, home children, enlisted and served in the wars, and they served in the US armies as well too. So it's not just in Canada. And some of them went back to Britain and served in the British armies as well. So wherever they were, they stepped up to the plate and offered their service to our countries. And I think that's remarkable. In 1917, they said that almost 100% of the home children that were in Canada that were eligible to enlist did. That's a ginormous number. It's staggering, really. And we had two Victoria Cross recipients. So we had Walter Rayfield and Claude Nooney, which is interesting because both of them gave false information on their attestation documents, and yet they had both been in Canada. They had both used their proper names, but when it came time to enlist, you know, variations of their names showed up. Walter Rayfield was never Rayfield. Rayfield wasn't a name in his whole entire family. To this day, we can't figure out where the Rayfield name came from. He was Lee. His last name was Lee, not Rayfield. So it's kind of interesting when you get into researching the home children. This whole name thing makes it a little bit more challenging and a little bit difficult. I mean, I'm searching high and low for a girl now, and her name is misspelled on the immigration records, on her Hazelbury monument. I can't find hide nor hair of her. I've tried every variation of her name. I've even gone through Library and Archives Canada, and of course, that list of children is missing from the archive, so I can't get her proper name on there either. I don't know if I'm ever gonna find her, but, it's definitely something that we're gonna keep working on, and hopefully, we'll get someplace with it, but their names were changed when they were taken into care, and I'm not talking Smith to White. I'm talking the spelling of their names, you know? They're mispronounced, so they're spelled wrong. And then they go on the shipping lists and, you get another variation of their spelling. And then you get into Canada and another variation of their spelling. So it's sometimes very difficult to track the kids. And some kids' names were deliberately changed. Emma Sterling was kind of famous for that one. Changed Delaney kids to Whitehead deliberately so that the father could never find those kids, and he never did. So it's a challenge when you're getting into the history of the home children. We have 4 to 6 million descendants of home children in Canada alone, and yet the silence. Most Canadians do not know the story, and most Americans who are connected have no clue that this had gone on. Most families do not know that their history connects to a home child, and that's something that we continue to work on with Home Children Canada, with our researchers and people like Penny May. I mean, these people are rock stars, trust me, and they give so much of themselves to this story and to the home children that I stand in awe of them every single day. Children records, I mean, that's something that we need to know is that if you are connected to a home child, there possibly is records available for them in the UK. The children records, these are the Bernardo records, which are the most detailed of all the records. Well, some of them are pretty detailed too, but these are pretty detailed. This is my Aunt Mary's record. So you want to know how come I know she was moved 20 times in 8 years and raped and beaten and all the rest of it, because it's in these records. 40 pages I got for Aunt Mary. And you know something? So that shows that Bernardo's knew what was going on. And who stepped in to stop it? If they sent these children to Canada to save them, who was saving Mary? Nobody. Absolutely nobody. They let this abuse carry on for this poor girl until her husband found her, and he was a Bernardo boy himself. And he took her out of the situation and married her and took her out west, and she flourished under his care. You would think that somebody that had been through so much trauma in her life, would have had a very difficult adult life, and, there's 100,000 children, 100,000 different stories. Some coped, others didn't. She did extraordinarily well, and I'm very, very proud to have her part of my family. September 28th on Sunday is our National British Home Child Day in Canada. In 2019, the Home Children Canada started our international tribute, which is called Beacons of Light. On September 28th, we have major landmarks, and it goes on in Canada, down into the States, England, Scotland, anywhere that we can get people to participate. So you have things like CN Tower and Niagara Falls, the Peace Bridge, and stuff like that that are going to be lit up on Sunday. And I think we're getting like 150, 200. I'm not head of the team this year, but they have so many tributes that are pouring in. It's just gonna be a spectacular year. In 2019, when we started it, we had 245 participants. So it's a very special day for the home children, and it is legislated through Parliament. So this is a true national day of recognition for the home children. So September 28th, tell somebody about the home children. Share the story, even if you're not connected. Make sure somebody knows. One of the things that we did with Home Children Canada when we started back in 2012 is as we promised our members that we would give them full access to any information that we found, and that would always be at no charge. And we've kept our word. However, there's so much more information that we're discovering now that I can't keep up on this, and our researchers as well too. So what we did a couple years ago is we formed a partnership with the Find My Past and the Library and Archives Canada. And like for an example, the Library and Archives Canada has released over 100,000 documents, but you can't find them. And we only know where they are because the late John Sayers in Ottawa had provided me with a loose index of where you could find that information. And it was our research team that went through that index page by page and then made a tighter index of where you can find that information. Now, yeah, that's available on our website, so you know where you can go and look, but it's a lot of page flipping. And if something happens a few years after, you may not pick up on that. But we've had a lot of people that are combing through that, and they're putting the information in our Facebook group. So one of the best resources for researching the children is to come to our Home Children Canada research group and just put the name in of your ancestor. And sometimes you would truly be amazed of what pops up. Now, with the partnership with Find My Past and Library and Archives Canada, the children's workhouse reports have been published now on Find My Past. And also the inspection reports. Library and Archives Canada has already handed over 27,000 inspection reports. Now, you can still find them through our website, or you can go to Find My Past and put the name in, and it comes up like that. There's no more page flipping. But the neat thing about it is they've kept to my word to people. They now provide this index to their members at no charge. So you do not need a subscription at all to search the home child index at Find My Past. You need a general membership, but you should never get asked for a subscription. And if you do, you're on the wrong page. So this information is available to the general public at absolutely no cost. There's lots of books out there that you could learn more about the home children. One of my favorites is called The Little Immigrants, The Orphans Who Came to Canada. It wasn't the first book because I read one by Cecilia Joette called No Thought for Tomorrow, the story of a Northern nurse. And I read it when I was about 14 years of age. Happened to be in my mother's basement, which was kind of ironic. I mean, she didn't know she was a home child at that time. Yeah, so I knew about the home children, but The Little Immigrants was something that I read not long after, discovering my mom's connection, because I wanted to know more about these programs. And it was very enlightening. He's an excellent author, so it's a great book to pick up and to read. And then you get more in-depth books. So there are a lot of books out there that get into the backgrounds and gets into the different programs. Imagined Orphans laboring children gets into the contracts the children had to sign and why they were indentured and what they were hoping to do with it. Uprooted, The Golden Bridge is my Bible for the sending organizations. Laying the Children's Ghost to Rest is another good book. New Lives for Old. And then we have our fiction book called The Forgotten Home Child. Now, that was written by Genevieve Graham, and it was published in 2020, the first wave of COVID. And that book was on the bestsellers list in Canada for about 4 months. Now, to date, to my knowledge, we've only had two best-selling books about home children in Canada, The Forgotten Home Children and The Little Immigrants. So it's absolutely incredible. She has sold about 70,000 copies of this book. I served as the historical consultant on The Forgotten Home Child, and I'm really proud of Genevieve and how she told the story and how she stuck to the facts. That's what I really love about the book. And so it's a great one to pick up and to read. And then I've got my books that I've written. Now, Bleeding of the Lands was something that I wrote for my mom because my mom always said, I just wish I could write a book about it. And so I've written her story in there. It contains lots of stories of various home children, bits of information, some photography that I did. I was privileged to know the last few surviving home children in Canada and was able to visit with them, interview them, record them, and work on a film that was being done at the time that they participated in. Emma Sterling died unmarried. Emma Sterling caught my attention a long time ago because she seemed to be the only one in Canada who really cared about what happened to those children when they came to Canada. And she was a Victorian activist in the rights of children and mothers. She started the very first Victorian daycare, and she started the very first Victorian Children's Aid Organization in Scotland. And that Children's Aid Organization is still running today. It's called Children First. But then she got involved with controversial child migration to Canada, and it was just a really rocky, rocky road for her. So there is a good content on the home children in this book. Um, and she caught my attention because she had one of her girls became pregnant in Nova Scotia, and she was taken to a doctor by a farmer who performed an illegal abortion on her and darn near killed the girl. And in retaliation, which should have happened anyways, Emma went to the authorities and she pressed charges against them, and they were arrested and put in prison. And the community members didn't seem to like that, or some of the people in the community, and they went in and torched her receiving home and burnt it to the ground. Now, there was 19 kids inside. They did get out with various injuries and stuff like that. But a lot of accounts of her story say that she fled to the United States and lived her life in obscurity. Well, she went to the United States. She did not go to the Quakers and she did not stay, she was not obscure. She continued her activism work all through the United States. One of the first things that I find her doing is rescuing circus children because, in those days they would deliberately deform children so that they would become circus acts. And the last thing that I find, and she had a whole bunch of stuff in between, but the last thing I find her doing is blowing the whistle on the slave-like conditions in the turpentine camps in southern Florida. And when you look at her picture on that, on the screen there, I mean, she's not a small woman with the big Victorian clothes and stuff that they would have worn in the time. And their cameras were not their little, you know, phone cameras. They would have been big cameras, and I got this big mental picture of her slinking around the outskirts of the turpentine camps taking photographs because that's what she did. And I'm thinking, it's like messing with the drug cartel, really. Emma winds up dead not long after that, and I'm not going to tell you why she died because I think you need to read the book. And, the book also was a combination of efforts from everybody in the community and people who also got interested in the story of Emma Sterling that did a lot of research for me and really wanted the story told. So I'm pretty proud of that book. Without our community, I don't know what I couldn't do this on my own. I just couldn't. And people think that you're amazing. And I'm thinking, no, our community is amazing, not me. Each and every one of us that contribute to this story, that puts the work in, that does it day in, day out. I mean, they're the amazing ones. It's incredible the network that we have going. Orphans of the Living is a book that, it's a historical book on the home children. It starts from, 1869 when the first home child came to Canada, and it goes right through to the end. There's a special section in there on King Charles, and, because he was involved with the Fairbridge Farms and had to pay compensation. And a lot of the information was found in those released documents. I've spent maybe about 4 years, and maybe a lot of the community members or group members as well spent a lot of time, the researchers, digging through. So we found out some really incredible and powerful things about these programs that really is helping to shed a new light on what really happened. So this book takes a particular focus of the involvement of the Canadian government, because again, this thing about why should Canada apologize? They had nothing to do with it. Well, our Canadian government was up to their eyeballs in it, and Lost but Not Forgotten is my fourth book, and it's written for 13 and above readers, really, because we want this taught in our school systems. And, we don't really have a good historical book that the kids can read. So it's toned down a bit from Orphans of the Living, and it's written, to speak to 13 and above, and get the story out there. And I also combine a lot of what they were doing into historical things that happened in Canadian history, like the making of the Canadian flag. We have that story in there as well too. Currently working on this fifth book, and it's expected to be released in the summer of 2026, but don't hold your breath. It's going to be a while. I need a kind of a bit of a break from all this writing. Voices from the Shadows is strictly going to be individual stories of the home children. So, we dig up incredible stories all the time, and we need to make sure they're entered in our registry, because we have a registry that has about 85,000 kids in our registry. So the stories are told in the registry, but they're told more in depth in this book. And I would expect that there'll be a second volume and a third volume as we continue, because we need these stories to be told. They need to be written down and they need to be shared. If you want to get in contact with us, it's www.homechildrencanada.com. You can join our Home Children Canada research group on Facebook. You can visit our Facebook page at Home Children Canada, or you can email us at homechildrencanada@gmail.com. Our research page that we have, the URL changed. So it's a little bit of a difficult transition, because so you can access that page at homechildrencanada.weebly.com. So I'm done with the presentation now. So Elizabeth, are you going to open it for
Yeah,
questions?
there are some questions. One question that I'm gonna actually start with, only because it's very convenient considering you have your contact information on the screen right now. But this lady named Susan said that she is doing her neighbor's genealogy, and his grandfather was a home child who came over in the early 1900s. And she was wondering if you were interested in this information. He and his brother immigrated to the US and they have good lives.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we like to hear the good lives too.
Yeah.
Honestly, we don't just want to focus on horrific things, but we have to understand that happen. So if you go on to the internet and just Google British Home Child or British Home Child or Children Registry, you're going to come up with a registry, because we're the only one online that has it. And when you come up with that home page, there is a submission form at the top that you can add your information to.
So the next question, somebody was asking, how do I find out what kind of family my great grandmother was sent to? She said that her mom or grandfather or mother never even knew she was a home child. I just found out by researching my genealogy a few years ago. Uh, she just knew bits and pieces that her mother knew about her grandmother's early life, but that's about it.
Well, what we need to do is do some research to find out who she was and if she's in our indexes, and also in our on our Facebook group. But if there are records available in the UK for her, then you need to really apply to that. I mean, that's the first place to go. And there's also little ways that you can find out. I mean, running their names through newspapers, you wouldn't believe
Yeah.
what I find when I do that. But a lot of the childcare records is the number one spot to go.
Somebody was asking, what year was the $30,000 paid?
2018.
2018. Okay, so there a question just came in. I have done a lot of research on a soldier who brought home a war bride. Do I send copies of the documents to the email address? He also had two sisters that came to Canada. I was able to document a name change between the records leaving England and the arrival in Canada.
Yeah, for sure. If you can send that to
Yeah.
homechildrencanada@gmail.com, that would be appreciated. Also, with the submission form for Home Children Canada, there is a place there that you can send documents or that through. Now, in the registry, we don't post the documents. We keep them on file. We use the information, but there's really only supposed to be a photograph of the child up there. So you won't see that
Yeah.
document in the registry. So
Yeah. The person who asked about the $30,000 said the payout was in 2018. My dad passed in 1986. Dang. It's yeah, 2018 is it's so recent that it's a shame that so many had passed and missed just the acknowledgement that like this happened. Yeah.
yep.
Well,
Yeah, I totally agree, and that upset a lot of descendants,
yeah, I can imagine. So we got one last question here, and then we'll wrap up for this evening because we're just about out of time. But before I get to that question, I want to remind everybody that this program is being recorded. So if you want to watch it again later, or if you have friends or family that couldn't watch this program, after it undergoes a little bit of editing, we will upload it to our YouTube channel, which I put a link to that in the chat a couple times, but feel free to send us an email if you would like that link sent directly to you. If you'd like a copy of the chat, our email is genealogy@acpl.info, which I'll put that in the chat really quick. Great. All right, so the final question, can I enter the census info of an adopted child to my great-grandfather's father? I'm not sure what they mean exactly.
you can enter census information, yeah, and we
Yeah,
encourage you to do that in the registry.
great. Okay, so I think that is about it. So
If
thank
you're
you.
confused, just send me an email at homechildrencanada@gmail.com. I'm the only one that picks up those emails, so you're gonna get me directly.
Yeah, I'm just typing that in the chat
And
one
if it
more
takes
time.
me a couple weeks to get back to you, you know, never hurts to send me a reminder email because we just get so many that come in.
I can imagine. Well, thank you, Lori, for such a really great presentation. It's such a really powerful and important topic. So I'm so glad you were able to give this talk for us.
Well, I'm really grateful to be here.
Yeah. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening. Like I said, if you have any questions for us at the library, our email is genealogy@acpl.info. Have a good night.
Thank you.